You're listening to the MindPod Network. Friends, lovers, and listeners, please support the It's All Happening podcast by heading over to iTunes and leaving this podcast a review, or using the Amazon portal at zachleary.com to buy lots of stuff. It's all happening. 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 It's all Hello, friends. Welcome to the podcast. Here we all are, episode 120 of the It's All Happening with Zach Leary podcast. That's me. I am your host. So happy that you are here. This week on the show, we have Michael Pollan, the author of the new book, How to Change Your Mind: What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. Really great stuff. Of course, you've heard of Michael Pollan. He's written the iconic books, The Omnivore's Dilemma, In Defense of Food, The Botany of Desire. So much great stuff. Such a pleasure to have him on the show. And to be fair, this episode was actually recorded for the MAPS podcast, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, the other show that I host. But the interview was so important and packed with so much good information and of such value that I felt it necessary to also use it for this show. But if you listen to the MAPS podcast, no, it's the same interview, so you don't have to listen twice. And we'll certainly get into Michael in a bit and what the book is about and all the amazing insights and discussions the book has ignited. But this release of the podcast was actually delayed a couple days, or I should say the It's All Happening release of the podcast, because due to the death of Anthony Bourdain, someone who was very influential for me. And I want to talk about that for a moment.
You know, I'd never had health insurance. I'd never owned a car. I'd never paid my rent on time. I hadn't filed my taxes in 10 years. I was a frightened, angry, desperate character who'd seen almost nothing of the world outside of kitchens. You know, it's 10 years later, 11 years later, I've had almost 10 years of the best job in the world, traveling around. I go anywhere I want. I stayed in a lot of nice hotels. I've eaten in some of the best restaurants in the world. I'm friends with a lot of the greatest chefs. I've seen life high and low. I've lived a life of incredible, almost overnight from who I was back then. My life changed so drastically. And maybe, you know, I'm older. I don't know that I'm wiser. I don't work for a living. I mean, writing, I have no sympathy for anyone fortunate enough to get paid any kind of money to write, whining about writer's block or how hard it is or some sort of internal torture. You're doing it in a sitting position. So right away, you know, I spent my whole adult life on my feet. I feel very lucky that anybody even gives a shit what I think. It's not something I'm used to, and it is a privilege to be able to write and have even 8 people care what you're saying.
That, of course, is Anthony Bourdain, taken from an interview he gave in Australia a few years back, promoting his book, Medium Raw. I encourage every one of you to read the article that Anthony sent to The New Yorker, sent unsolicited back in the 90s when he was the executive chef at a New York City French bistro. The article is "Don't Eat Before Reading This." This is the article that changed his life. and much to his surprise, they published it. And then what followed after that was his transformation into the Anthony Bourdain we knew and loved. The life lesson there is obvious. It's amazing. Take risks, write things, send them to people with no expectation on whether they will publish it or not publish it, like it or not like it. Just do your thing and see what happens. For myself personally, Bourdain was one of my all-time heroes, and I know for many of you who listen to this podcast, you might be surprised at that. In many ways, he was one of my mentors in life, even though I didn't know him and he didn't know it. He brought culture, intellect, swagger, taste, adventure, and poetry, and a no fucks given attitude towards truly living life that for me was nearly unmatched. Honestly, it reminded me a lot of my father. Just that wide-eyed, open, full circle view of the world and all of its potential and all of its beauty hidden under the nooks and crannies of every alleyway that humanity occupies. I'm truly devastated. I haven't cried for a notable person's death since Jerry Garcia. And to let some of you know, he was also my #1 dream podcast guest for this show. So it's a tough one for me for sure. Suicide is complicated. Why did he want to get off the ride? We'll never know. He seemed to have everything going for him, the top of his game, a beautiful family, a craft that was globally recognized and loved. So we never really understand what's going on inside someone's head. And the only thing I can say about that is if you're feeling any sort of despondency or depression, find someone to talk to. And in terms of Anthony Bourdain, specifically about him and a way that you can honor what his mission and contribution to the world and to culture was, go to that neighborhood restaurant that is, off the beaten path in a funky part of town in a culturally adventurous sort of place, and find the restaurant there that you've always heard about but you've never gone to. Order something off the menu that's different and weird and spicy. Talk to the locals, talk to the manager. Find out what's good. Of course, if you can afford to travel and go to some far-off land, that's great too. But start with your own community. See what happens. Get outside of your bubble. That was Anthony Bourdain's message to the world, and I'll miss him terribly. So yes, God bless Anthony Bourdain. Godspeed. This week on the podcast, Michael Pollan, the author of the new book, How to Change Your Mind with the New Science of Psychedelics, teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. Michael, until this book, was not part of the psychedelic community. He is very, very famous and iconic even for his insights into food and agriculture and sustainability. So when he took on this topic, it created a shockwave throughout the psychedelic ecosystem. And I can say, at least speak for myself, I have not seen a book come out on psychedelics that has been so hotly debated and loved and critiqued and discussed on the mainstream level outside of the insular psychedelic community. He's been on the Tim Ferriss podcast, the Sam Harris podcast, Joe Rogan, and I encourage you to listen to all of those. They're very, very insightful, and to read the book. It is a very objective, sensible, and steady view into the power that the psychedelic research happening today has. So check out the book, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Zach. Good to be here.
It's such a pleasure. So I wanted to start off the podcast by saying I can't remember the last time a new book had such an impact on the psychedelic community at large, near, far, wide, deep, old, new. This book is really, really making the rounds and causing a huge surge of discussion, praise, some critique, all around, just really amazing chatter. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Very gratifying, and I have to say, completely unexpected.
Well, certainly, for speaking for myself personally, I've been reading your work for quite some time. Obviously, I'm a chef myself. I love to cook, and your impact into the world of food and agriculture is obviously very, very important. So I do have to ask the question that you've been asked a few times now, but I want to ask it again. This seems like quite a departure from what you normally write about, the omnivore's dilemma or anything like that, or about, your relationship with the garden and the earth and agriculture. Is it a departure from that, or is it actually closer than we think?
I think it is closer than most people think. To my mind, it's pretty continuous with my interests. It's a departure in that I had to learn a whole new subject, and that's what was exciting about it. I had to learn about neuroscience. I had to learn about the natural history of the psilocybe mushroom and a lot about psychology and depression and addiction. And so it brought me into these whole new subject areas, which is kind of thrilling. I mean, that's what I like about being a journalist, is you get paid as an adult to learn new subjects. I mean, how many people get that? We're very lucky that way. But the continuity flows from the fact that, as I see it, my subject has not been food or agriculture per se, but our engagement with the natural world. And I've been writing about that since Second Nature, my first book, from 1991, I think it was. And I've always been interested in our relationship to other species and how we change them and they change us, and how these other species work on us by gratifying our desires and getting us to propagate them and take them all over the world. And those desires are interesting. I mean, some are obvious, like the desire to nourish ourselves or the desire for beauty, sweetness. But there is this other really kind of strange human desire that appears to be universal, shared by all cultures, and that is the desire to change consciousness.
Right. And we've been doing that since we came out of the cave and huddled around the fire, right? Yeah.
And so what is that about? I mean, some of it is, we understand, relief of pain or boredom, that kind of makes sense. But for thousands of years, people have been using more disruptive chemistries, such as psychedelics. Psychedelics didn't begin in the 60s, God knows. I mean, it's got an ancient history. And so I've always been curious to unpack that desire. What does it tell us about ourselves, and what does it tell us about the species that have figured out how to change our consciousness, like the psilocybe mushroom or the peyote cactus?
Well, and I love that, like the implication just with the title of your book, How to Change Your Mind. And for me, that implies this kind of concept, this kind of determination, especially within the Western world, that our mind is made up. And that desire to want to change our consciousness, with intention. I don't mean for pain or sickness, but to, intentionally wanting to change your consciousness has been lost in sort of the modern Western world a little bit. And not only lost, but it's also been vilified.
Well, most of the changes of consciousness that our society approves of basically just makes you a better worker,
Right.
We're okay with caffeine, which is a great drug. I'm completely addicted.
Likewise.
and do not fight that addiction. But we're highly medicated as a culture, and most of the medications we take, whether it's for ADD or depression, allow us to function essentially, and focus and get the job done. And but there are these other chemicals that propose a more radical change in consciousness that are not compatible with work. And I mean, they actually may, encourage creativity in various ways. In the long term, they may contribute to work, but in the short term, they take too long. They leave people in such an altered state that they may not conform. They're more challenging to the status quo. Nevertheless, they've found their place in many societies, and they can actually contribute to the status quo, depending on what that status quo is. I mean, in traditional societies, these medicines are used to heal people, or for divination, or for worship, and so I think they're less disruptive, but they're used very carefully.
Well, and they found its place in our culture as well. I mean, you said especially within the creative mindset and the creative path. I mean, there's no question the psychedelic influence on music, on art, on fashion, on so much has really taken it's changed the world overnight.
Without question.
Yeah, without question. We'll talk about that in a second. But so you were born in 1955, so you weren't quite there for the peak of the 60s, at least in your formative years. So what drew you to this? How did you get curious? I know the New Yorker article, The Trip Treatment, was it was quite successful and a great exploration. But how did you land up here? How did you end up here?
I came pretty late to psychedelics. I didn't really have psychedelic experiences in my college years or teenage years. For a variety of reasons, some accidental. They weren't around. They were never made available to me for some weird reason. They weren't at my college when I was there. But also, I don't know that I would have indulged. I didn't feel sturdy enough. I had heard all the 60s horror stories. By the time I came of age, that mix of urban legends and medical alerts, drug education, all made LSD and psilocybin sound terrifying. And I didn't think I was such a sturdy person emotionally that I could sustain that sort of assault on my sanity. And that's how I saw it. I remember writing a short story when I was in 10th grade about the worst acid trip I could imagine. I had no idea what I was doing, but it ended in this poor guy, taking a broken piece of glass to his wrists, and that's what I thought would happen. So I stayed away, and it was really only when I started learning about the science. I am a science journalist, ostensibly, and I started reading some of these papers and accounts of them, and I was so curious as to how a psychedelic, which I had been taught to believe made you crazy, could actually make you sane.
I just had to pause and think about that for a second. So, can actually make you sane. So, would you?
Could be used in a therapeutic setting.
Absolutely. So, would you say now that you've done all of this research and the statement that you just made about your early impressions of psychedelics, that the propaganda that planted the initial seed within your consciousness about, oh my God, they'll make you crazy, you're going to jump out of a window, induce psychosis or whatnot. Now that you've taken in all of this data and talked to so many people, do you your initial impression was not correct?
Well, my initial impression was, sensationalistic. There was some kernel of truth. There are people who get into psychological trouble with psychedelics. There's no question.
Anything, sure.
That there are risks, and there are cases of people who, were perhaps on a path to schizophrenia, but that path was hastened by a psychedelic experience. And, I've been out talking about this a lot, and my general approach is that, hey, this is a powerful tool. We should be looking at it. It has enormous benefit. It benefited me. But I do hear from people over and over again who know someone who they regard as a casualty of psychedelics. And I can't vet all those stories. But the fact is they're real. I mean, some people have been damaged by these drugs, and look, all drugs have their upside and their downside, and there are psychological risks. The physiological risks are actually pretty mild compared to so many drugs we take without thinking. We tend to exaggerate the risks of illicit drugs over illicit drugs, and so there is a lot of propaganda. But you sort through that, and you have to realize that, these drugs are probably not for everybody, and the kind of screening process that goes on in the university trials and to some extent goes on in the underground therapy sessions, where they really are trying to screen out people at risk for serious mental illness is important. And so I wouldn't, I would always urge caution to people and make them realize that this is a fateful step. You are in some sense rolling the mental dice. There are great potential for that to work out, and more likely to work out than not. But for some people, it can be a pretty terrifying experience.
There's no question. I mean, they are not for everybody. I definitely am one of those people. I'm not a zealot, and I don't think that you should be able to walk into an acid test, pay $1, and fill up a coffee cup of acid and see what happens.
Yeah.
So, when I, as a cultural, I guess, pundit and historian of myself, not old enough to be alive in the 60s, I look back on it with the kind of the position and the perspective that a big problem with psychedelic research and with the proliferation of psychedelics in the 60s was that too many people did them too fast without much historical context. They just appeared on the scene like almost overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And the generation gap was so much wider back then. And, there weren't many books on the subject. People didn't know what a shaman was. People, didn't know about, all the great ancient cultures and indigenous ceremonies that Terence McKenna brought out, decades later. So too many people did it too fast, and it really kind of created a cultural hysteria, which separated the legitimate scientific research from the, the cultural recreational use. Is there somewhere where we can bridge the gap perhaps more intelligently this time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're going to repeat those mistakes. I think your summary of what happened was right on target. I mean, I think that the molecules arrived without any context. And if you look at traditional cultures that have used some of the same molecules and others, they always included a guide of some kind, whether it was a shaman or curandera or whatever, some elder who knew the territory. They always had some degree of ritual or ceremony. There was a whole syntax to the whole experience, and people didn't do it alone. It was not an individual thing. It was a social thing. And it's sort of like, eating alone versus eating together. There's safety in eating together for many reasons, and people tend to eat more healthily when they eat together. So the molecules arrived without that context. And that, I think, was a big part of it. We were trying to figure out how best to use them. And some of the uses were terrible. I mean, dosing people without their permission, putting it in the punch bowl. Sure. The kinds of things that you hear stories about, whether it was done by the counterculture or the CIA. They were both doing the same thing. And that, that strikes me as incredibly cruel and reckless. But some people, gradually moved toward an understanding and developing a kind of protocol. And I think that's where we are now. I think as a society, I mean, we're not entirely comfortable with the shamanic paradigm, and we're not entirely comfortable with the medical paradigm, which is our version of shamanism, right? White coat shamanism. We impute to doctors the kind of authority to heal us that traditional cultures have given to their healers who were shamans, and using different technologies, but the same power of suggestion, the same placebo effect are involved, depending on what vocabulary you want to use. So I think the challenge before our culture now is to figure out what is the best container for these molecules. What is the path toward incorporating them in our society, if indeed we conclude that they're worth incorporating? And that really is a scientific question, I think, in part. I mean, I think we have to see if the next set of trials, which are getting underway, bear out the strong signals of the therapeutic value of these molecules that we've had since the late 90s. Because, as Bob Jesse, one of the sources in my book and one of the really behind the scenes motive energies that has contributed to this renaissance of psychedelic research, says okay, you can medicalize it, and there'll be people with DSM diagnoses who will have access to it through their psychiatrist. Yeah. But what about the betterment of well people? These drugs have value for people who aren't sick, and so how do you make them available? Is the cannabis model, which in our state, is pretty straight up legalization for anybody over 18,
right?
To 21, I'm not sure. I think it's 18. Is that the right model? I sort of doubt it. I think that may not be as well regulated as psychedelics need to be.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. I don't have the answers. I'm pretty new to this, and I'm still learning. And but something tells me that the lessons of history are that the use of this needs to be organized in some way. And so maybe there's a role for the licensed guide, whether that person is a doctor or not. The fact that we carve out an exemption for religious use under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and people can use ayahuasca or peyote if they're in the Native American church, or a handful of other churches, that's an interesting path too. In that case, you do have elders, and you do have ceremony, and you do have a kind of care that goes into it. But it's hard to legislate scrupulousness. But that's kind of what we need.
Yeah, it is. I don't think anybody really has the answer, the correct answer for that yet, for how to legislate scrupulousness. That's funny. But I do, inherently believe and passionately believe that the individual does have the right to change their consciousness.
I do too. I do too, but I don't know that it, like a lot of rights, is it completely unfettered, or is it, even with the right to free speech, which is very important to us as journalists, there are some limitations, and some of them are healthy and some are not. So anyway, it's a really interesting question, and I think it's one of the important cultural projects that we will have the opportunity to engage in over the next few years.
So, as we are kind of engaging in this, and there is, your book has obviously, created a lot of momentum, but you saw from your research, there is so much going on with the work that MAPS is doing, and Horizons, and Johns Hopkins, and NYU, and
Hefter and USONA. These are two nonprofits who are doing really important work promoting the psilocybin research.
It's really amazing stuff. Is there something, an area or a trend or something that you found to have the most potential that really stood with you after you finished this book, that you were like, wow, this is where, we really have to be keeping an eye on this, because this is really promising?
Well, I think the work on depression is very encouraging. That wasn't in the initial plan. There was a lot of study of people with cancer, and they saw a strong signal that it helped with depression. But that's a particular kind of depression, and people who have what's called major depression, not related to an outward change in circumstance like a cancer diagnosis, that there is a signal that they're getting great benefit. There was a study at Imperial College that was small. It's only about 20 patients, and it was open label. But they're now going to launch a big trial, and they're going to compare psilocybin to the standard of care, which I think is an antidepressant, an SSRI. I think that is one to watch. There's some effort to get an eating disorder test trial going at Hopkins. I think that is very exciting. The kind of rigid, obsessive self-criticism that is part of anorexia, for example. It is kind of a form of obsession. Yeah. And there is good reason to believe from the neuroscience that the psilocybin can help break those kind of cycles of rigid thinking. And so that seems to me a disorder which we have very few tools to treat right now, and kills a great number of people and immiserates a much larger number. I think that's very exciting to watch. I also think the pure science that's going on at Imperial College in London is really interesting. Imaging the brains of people on psychedelics, trying to kind of develop a theoretical framework to understand the mechanisms. What do they teach us about consciousness? My interest in psychedelics is I'm interested in psychedelics per se as a subject, but I'm really interested in the window they open on things like consciousness, which, by the way, we don't know very much about at all. On the concept of the self and how real is that, on mental disorders and where they come from. Why do brains go operate in a faulty manner that's destructive to the individual? How does the ego, which is supposed to advance our interests, sometimes turn against us and make us miserable? All these kind of questions. It's that Stan Grof quote from years ago when he said, psychedelics would be for the study of the mind what the microscope was for biology or the telescope for astronomy. This is a really audacious quote.
It's huge.
I think he's onto something. And
it is. I think
it's yielding very interesting information.
And what he's implies in a lot of his work, and McKenna and certainly Timothy as well, was that one of the great flaws of the human condition is that we perceive reality, this thing that we call reality, to be certain. This is it. This is exactly how it works, and you can really see how myopic that is by, the issues of the day and what political administrations focus on. They focus on very kind of small, short-term stuff. They don't look at big picture, consciousness expanding, paradigm shifting stuff. And psychedelics, they pierce the veil. They shatter that window. They give you a new perspective to see your ego, your world. And I love what you were saying about addiction and, about eating disorders. And I put that into the category of addiction as a whole.
I think that's right. I think that the distinctions we make between eating disorders, addiction, even depression and anxiety, you could argue that they're all forms of addiction, some to certain behaviors and others to certain kinds of thinking. In all cases, there is a kind of stuckness, a loop of rumination and
Bill
behavior.
Wilson saw that.
Yeah, he did. And so breaking out of the box you're in, even temporarily, can be liberating and show you that, there is another way to think about this. There is another. I mean, in my own experiences, I was, I had some very important personal breakthroughs about the role of the ego and got a little perspective on my own ego. And after the experience was over, I was like, okay, but what good is that? I mean, my ego is back in uniform and on patrol as, I was back to baseline. And my guide / therapist said, well, having had a taste of that other perspective, you can cultivate it. And that's where the hard work begins, of applying what you learned during the psychedelic experience to your life. And that's why integration, as they call it, is really important. And that's another example of how the sort of carelessness with which we began using these drugs, didn't serve us well, because it may be that integration is one of the most important parts of the experience, even though you're not high at all. Yeah. What you're doing is interpreting what happened and figuring out lessons that you can apply to the conduct of your life. So I think that's one of the things we're learning. And, it's not surprising that we wouldn't have figured any of this out right away. It's something new under the sun, for us, for the West. But we're getting there.
So speaking of integration and, the diffusion of the ego, what's one of the most compelling parts of your book is that you chose to embark on some traveling yourself, which is fantastic. And I just want to make sure I have the facts correct. Before you did these 3 different stages of trips, LSD, psilocybin, 5-MeO, you had not done psychedelics before that, correct?
I had never had a big psychedelic trip. I had used some mushrooms in my 20s. Okay. And now looking back, I realized it was a low dose kind of aesthetic experience. Really interesting.
Heroic dose.
It wasn't, so not heroic. It was chicken shit. But I didn't know. I didn't even know how much you were supposed to take. And so for all intents and purposes, I was a psychedelic virgin until my late 50s.
So going into your late 50s, I mean, that is that is huge, because you are very, I at least from the outside, you seem very self-aware and self-assured and kind of confident and well-defined in who you are and, the role that you play in this world. So there you go, you jumping into psychedelics to do first-person research into this book. Tell me about it.
Well, I approached it with a lot of trepidation because I didn't know the territory, and I am, I'm a careful person, and there was nothing. I didn't feel there was anything broken in my life, but I also felt that.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, I guess so.
That's a great way to go in. Yeah.
Yeah, you may be right. And I did feel, okay, I'm fairly sturdy, and now I can withstand the assault on my ego that perhaps I could not have in my 20s. I mean, it may have been a very good thing I waited. But there were two forms of curiosity. One was journalistic curiosity. I was talking to these volunteers, and they had amazing experiences that were very hard to understand or believe, of experiences of the divine, of a universal consciousness, beyond the consciousness supposedly generated by our brains. And life-changing experiences over the course of a single day. Yeah. And as a journalist, writing about this, how could I possibly describe that without having first-person experience? It's also just the way I work as a journalist. I do immersion journalism. I mean, when I wrote about the cattle industry for Omnivore's Dilemma, I bought a steer. And when I wrote about architecture, I built a house. And when I want to learn how to bake, I apprentice myself to a great baker. And that's just kind of, I like learning that way. I think that there's only so much you can get from books and interviews. Finally, you have to do things. And they give you great opportunity as a writer, because you get to tell a story of your own experience. And since you're doing something for the first time, you have a point of view that no one else has, including the most experienced psychonauts. If they can remember their first time, great. But the sense of wonder and first sight is really special. And I realized I had that opportunity. So there were these literary journalistic reasons that, yeah, I had to do this. But frankly, there was also, I was interviewing people who I had come to envy. They had had spiritual experiences. I had not. I view myself as somewhat spiritually retarded. And the whole idea of spiritual experience kind of was an insult to my worldview, which was very materialistic, naturalistic. I really thought the laws of nature could explain everything. And that may still be the case, but I have more questions than I did before. So I was envious of these people and their experience. So that became a more personal driver that made me want to see, could I learn something new at this age that would actually, rock my world? And
did you?
And in the event, I did.
What not that the specific compound is that important, but of the three, what was the most profound for you?
Well, I don't think the specific compound is that important, and I don't know that. And I think the dose is the most important.
Agreed.
And I
totally agree.
I had the highest dosed experience on psilocybin. It could well have been LSD. For various circumstances, it wasn't. And this was a guided trip. And also, in addition to the dose, it was the setting and the set. I mean, the fact that I was in a place I felt comfortable with a woman I trusted implicitly allowed me to go deeper and further than I ever had before. And the most remarkable part of that journey, which was a guided trip with an underground guide, who I call Mary in the book, it was that I did see my ego completely dissolve. First, it turned into a sheaf of little Post-its blown away. And the amazing thing was I had no desire to assemble them back into a pile of me. And then the question arises, who was the consciousness that was perceiving this process? Because I'm seeing myself. And I don't know the answer to that. That was the really curious thing about it, that there was this other, much more objective, disinterested, unburdened, undefensive consciousness that was taking in the scene and was fine with it. And then I saw myself painted over the landscape. I just became a coat of paint, very thin and extensive.
Sounds beautiful.
It was actually. It was, it could be horrible if you fight the dissolution of your ego. It's a death, right? It's a death of something very important to you. But once you surrender to it, you realize there is something on the other side. Something survives the death of the ego. And that something is a kind of a perspective that is something to cherish. So that was a big experience for me. It was followed by, a sense of merging, in this case with a piece of music, a Bach unaccompanied cello suite, number 2 in D minor. It was an amazing, very sad piece of music. I mean, this wasn't ecstatic in the sense of being happy. It was ecstatic in the sense of being out of my body and part of something larger. And that larger was, the vibrations coming off of a cello and traveling out into the universe. And it was amazing. And I felt completely reconciled to anything, including death. There was no struggle. And I understood the perspective of the cancer patients and how they had emerged from their drug, experience with a new understanding of death and a greater equanimity about it. And it had something to do with this sense of merging into a larger entity, whether that was nature, the universe, the divinity. And it had something to do with the acquisition of this other perspective where their death didn't seem quite so big a deal.
Do you feel like it's changed your work from here on out, or the approach to your work? And
yeah, I don't know about my work. I don't know. It took me into a new place as a writer because I was describing experiences that were purely in my head. And I had never done that before. I'm a journalist. I work in this tight box of facts, that come at us from the external world. And here I was able to write a narrative about something completely imaginary, or whatever we want to call it, but something that was the product of my mind and not the product of the world out there. Although it was partly the product of the world out there.
Well, that was new territory for me. And it turned out, I approached the writing of these experiences with great trepidation and how do you describe these experiences? I'd read a lot of trip reports on Arrowhead and, most of them are not great pieces of literature. And so how would I get this across? And as a literary challenge, it was as stiff a challenge as I've ever faced. But in the event, it turned out to be really fun to write about this. I actually had more pleasure writing the trip scenes than anything in the book. Once I figured out a voice in which to do it, the reader has to decide whether I succeeded, obviously, but there are not a lot of models. I mean, there are tons of trip reports, but there are not a lot of models of pieces that you read and you really get it. And that's what I was trying to do. And it was great fun. There's a great Terence McKenna quote, one of my favorites, is there is a space beyond language. It's just so damn hard to talk about.
Yeah, by definition. There is William James said the mystical experience is ineffable. Yet here we are trying to F it. But, that's, to a writer, this is an exciting challenge because there is a use of language beyond description.
Yes.
And that, of course, is metaphor. Simile. We have these other tools. And when you find the right metaphor, you can convey an unconveyable experience. And so that's the really interesting struggle. And, there's nothing more exciting to a writer.
So you mentioned at the beginning of you telling me about these experiences, you mentioned something very interesting about your own context within them, is that going in, well, there's nothing really wrong with me, I don't have any disorders or, whatever. So here you are, in your late 50s going into this with, purely from a personal research journalistic perspective. So how does that How do you see that relating with because in some ways it's not quite scientific. You almost did a recreational.
Yeah, I mean, except that it was, I was doing it in the company of people who were therapists. I wasn't trying to fix something that you could find in the DSM, but I think mental illness is on a continuum. I mean, all of us get depressed. Even if we're not pathologically depressed, all of us have addictive behavior, even if we don't abuse alcohol or cigarettes or whatever. I mean, I'm addicted to caffeine, and I'm addicted to Twitter and Facebook and things like that. Actually, not Facebook, but I am addicted to Twitter. So I think we shouldn't look at people with mental illness as another kind of creature. This is us taken to a further and more painful extreme. I don't mean to minimize the suffering, but only suggest that we should have compassion because we've all been there to some extent or another, and that we all have habits we'd love to break. We all are stuck in ruts of thinking. We all obsess about certain things. Yes. And we all suffer from the harsh rule of an ego that sometimes is punishing. And so that's what when you talk about the betterment of well people, the only reason you can get better is you're not so well.
Well, I mean,
there would be no betterment.
I mean, and that's exactly it. I mean, the betterment of people and changing the relationship with the ego, which perhaps could, one could get more compassion, more empathy. And as we see, and as you have uncovered in your food research so very well, the world is getting smaller. Our resources are getting more precious. So we have to learn to share and get along. And, psychedelics have always been a good tool for that. I mean, do you agree?
Yeah, I completely agree. Look, I mean, if you think about the problems we face as a civilization, the two biggest, in my view, is the environmental crisis, which flows from our sense of disconnection from nature, our objectifying of nature, which allows us to extract, exploit, put pigs on feedlots. I mean, do horrible things because we don't feel connected to the natural world. Yeah. That's the predicate of the way we're behaving. It's a predicate for climate change. It's a predicate for the industrial food system. And then the other thing, which is not so different, is our disconnection from people unlike ourselves, that we objectify them. And that allows us to build walls and discriminate and engage in racist behavior and sexist behavior. And one of the things that psychedelics does pretty reliably is, and this has to do with reducing the volume of the ego, which is really patrolling all those borders and making us see the other as an object, is diminish that and reestablish those connections. You asked at the beginning about the continuity with my work. I've always been interested in plants and the intelligence of plants, and I've written about that a lot. And I've always had a belief that they are more like subjects than objects, even though we treat them as objects. Well, on psychedelics, that became a felt reality. That became a revealed truth. I was acutely aware of the consciousness or spirit in all these creatures in my garden, and you can't treat nature quite the same way, I think, and the same is true for other people. I mean, one of the most common things people report is this feeling of love for everything that exists, and God knows we need more of that. So there is a very specific relevance. The challenge, though, becomes how do you apply that at a societal level?
Integration thing again. Yeah.
It's the integration thing, but it's also, can you prescribe a drug to a culture?
Well,
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, and that made me want to bring up something again, which you just said, that experience of love that is a very common effect that many people share with the psychedelic experience. So if you look back on the 60s and, at just sort of the soundbite cliche, tenets of 60s counterculture was, the peace and love movement, the anti-war movement.
The environmental movement.
The environmental movement, the sexual revolution, civil rights, all of these things were born out of the 60s. So that was a huge threat in the 60s. So what do you think went wrong then? I mean, I read your book, and I know you kind of you gave my dad a little bit of a hard time, but it's just I know we have a hard stop in 10 minutes or so, but let's. I'm curious, what do you think went wrong then? Because so many of those things did happen in the 60s. So how can we
a lot
keep
went
it
right. Look, I'm not somebody. I mean, most Americans my age, you can divide into people who feel good about the 60s and enjoyed it and felt it was made a very positive contribution to our culture, and people who detest the 60s and thinks it's the root of every problem we face. And the right-left divide is really a 60s divide, I think, to a remarkable extent, given how long ago this was. And I would be in the former camp. I generally think that we live in a world created by the 60s, and some of the best things about this world, apart from the backlash against it, were products of the 60s, whether you're talking about civil rights, which is kind of a pre-psychedelic phenomenon, but the environmental movement, feminism, organic food, the food movement. All these things are products of the 60s, and in part products of the consciousness that psychedelics and to some extent your father helped nurture. Nevertheless, as often happens with movements, they overreach or they go too far, and they sometimes spark a backlash.
Right.
My sense is that your father lost patience with science, and that he had a reaction which is not so unusual, which is that these tools are so powerful, and that it would be foolish to wait on the conclusion of double-blind controlled trials, which he didn't even think were possible with psychedelics. And that we should simply, we knew enough to give them to everybody.
But he didn't think that they should be given to everybody. He was pretty clear about that. That, even in the famous Ted Kennedy congressional session, he said, they are not for everybody. The driver's license method, and they have their warnings, they have their limitations, and so on.
But the message that people were getting from his famous phrase, tune in, turn on, drop out, and addressing large crowds of people, which is not something scientists normally do. Right. He was broadening the who should be prescribed these drugs. And look, it isn't his fault that it prompted the kind of backlash it did. This was coming. These drugs were very threatening. I think he
didn't intend to start a revolution. That was not,
No, that was definitely not. And, maybe had he not been kicked out of academia, he would have stayed. But I don't think he was comfortable there. And I think that he felt as people, and look, this is happening to researchers now, even though they're trying to keep a lid on it because they remember the example of Timothy Leary, that they do feel like, oh my God, this has value to our civilization. I mean, I've heard this from several of these researchers. The question then becomes, well, do you become an evangelist and just try to spread the word, or do you keep on the path of Western science with all its impatiences and limitations? And so far, that's what they're doing. But the temptation and the exuberance that flows from this is real. And so I think that. And the fact that, too, you had, Richard Nixon was in office and you had a war going on. And as your father memorably said, people who take LSD aren't going to fight your wars or join your corporations. And he was right about that. And that was that taunted the powers that be, and they reacted. And they reacted cruelly, viciously. I mean, he was chased down in a way that was unforgivable. But the thing to keep in mind, I think, the positive legacy. So I think the scientists at that time, as you well know, and I describe in the book, felt that he was making their lives difficult and made it difficult to proceed with science. And they tried very hard to get him to moderate his positions. But the fact is Rick Doblin has reminded me, and I think he's completely right, that Timothy Leary created the world in which this research could resume, even if he also created the world in which it was stopped. And the fact is that there are now regulators, and I'm speculating here, but without question, there are regulators in the FDA and other parts of government who now, they've been turned on. They know the territory. They're not going to react as strongly or benightedly as people who had no idea what psychedelic experience was like. You have all these scientists, many of whom, no doubt, had psychedelic experiences that inspired their work. Right. He helped create the culture in which this renaissance could take place.
Well, that absolutely true, and I love that quote. And when I look back on it, and I think, well, my God, in 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president. In 1968, I mean, of course, Bobby Kennedy was killed. But the generation gap was so much wider then, and we know better now. And sure, people in positions of power have turned on, but we elected Donald Trump. So.
Yes, I know. Well, 2 steps forward, 6 steps back.
6 steps back. Well, your book is incredible, Michael. It's really it was really a joy to read, and the contribution that you've made to this community is certainly you've lit it on fire. But the final question I wanted to ask, as we have to go, is for somebody who is new to psychedelics, who is not part of the culture, who is not an experienced psychonaut or traveler or a deadhead or whatever, and they are somewhat curious about what's going on in a very objective, calm, stable, steady sort of way. Where do you suggest they start? Like, what do watch or read or? Yeah,
well, I mean, if they're contemplating having an experience, I really do like Jim Fadiman's book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. I think that's a pretty common sense distillation of the wisdom, going back to the 60s and forward to the current research on how to prepare. And it doesn't tell you how to find a guide, but it tells you how to make good use of a guide. And I think a guided experience is very important. That there's somebody who has more experience than you. Sorry. I think a guided experience is very important and the safest way to do it psychologically. I think you should, if you're on other meds, check it out with your doctor. I mean, I did that. I called my cardiologist, and because I was curious.
Ruled out MDMA.
What?
You ruled out MDMA.
Yes, he did. He did. He felt because it was an amphetamine that would be a mistake, given issues with my heart. So do your due diligence. Don't be careless. It's a big step. It's momentous, and it potentially could be, transformative in wonderful ways. But you need to realize that there are some risks, and pay attention to what Timothy, advised. And the key point is set and setting, the internal and external environment in which this experience is going to happen. But anyway, Fadiman's book is a good place to start. I've also listed a lot of new resources on my website that I think will be very helpful. There's the phenomenon of peer integration. Even if you don't have a therapist, there are groups that get together to talk about their psychedelic experiences and help people make sense. And the psychedelic societies, 100 of which or so have sprung up only in the last couple years, are good places. There's probably one in your community. And I've listed them all on my website if you want to get in touch. And these are places you can go to talk about the experience, because being alone with it on any level is not helpful. It's like eating alone, as I said earlier. It's not nourishing in quite the same way.
Absolutely. Well said. The book, How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. Michael Pollan, such a pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, Zach, great talking to you. Thanks a lot for doing this.